Welcome back. You here with Goldberg. Today I'll be talking about my present view of natalism and antinatalism. So in spring of 23, I got suggested a bunch of content from self-described antinatalists on the youtube.com. These aren't big channels, not the aspiring AdSense kings or queens, content creators, just regular folks expressing their opinion, the old school YouTube, which I miss greatly. And this girl stood out because it strikes me as requiring a certain level of courage and self-awareness as a woman to have such opinions, particularly in a type of culture that tends to predominate in India. She doesn't want to show her face, which is understandable because she would get dogpiled by a bunch of frustrated trad cells. Oh, enjoy your cats. This is outrageous. Sometimes you have to think beyond what you have seen in the past because and not be as egotistical. We'll have to go more into that as we proceed. The one part of her argument I didn't care for is when she said, I won't have enough money. We know you can raise kids on a shoestring budget or use welfare. At the same time, I'm not aware how luxurious government support happens to be in India, but we shouldn't discount how parental resources can in fact be an advantage. So let's say your parents make a good amount of money and they can afford to send you when you're 15 for a year in Europe at an international school. That's going to substantially broaden your horizons, give you more social, romantic opportunities, maybe future networking for a career. You'll likely blossom at an earlier age, be a more enhanced conversationalist, even if you've just traveled a lot as a kid. There's going to be a difference from that in most people who go to some podunk high school or get homeschooled out in the boongies. Exceptions will exist, but let's just not be too quick to throw out the relevance of parents having some amount of money. Now, if we scroll down here, there's an important factor. This guy's saying, I don't know why anyone would want to reproduce in India, subcontinent, because of the crowds, corruption, lack of civic sense, pollution. And this is something that we have to be clear cut on. I have great contempt for a certain group of people that when you point out there's overpopulation, they have these smarmy, glib comebacks, which are not sourced in good faith or evidence. It's just they follow specific religious conceptions which require them to say these things. And I'll delve more into that later in the video, but there is a significant problem with overpopulation. Now, it's true in Europe and parts of the West, certain groups are being encouraged not to reproduce. There is that agenda. But on a macro level, there absolutely is excessive population in some regions. It doesn't mean anyone is personally at fault for existing or anything like that, but at least being aware of this and mindful shows a level of maturity that most of these trad people completely lack in my experience interacting with them. The South Asian Indian subcontinent, China in particular, for at least a couple hundred years, they've been sources of cheap labor, especially men, which have less intrinsic value for society. They have been taken and sent around the world. The British brought a ton of South Asians to Africa. You have many in Central America, especially the Caribbean as well, Europe increasingly, even in South America. Canada, big example of a lot of regions being essentially demographically replaced by Chinese and South Asians. So this is a real phenomenon. It doesn't matter how much doesn't align with your vision of the world. But the funny thing is that the ones that claim there's no overpopulation will also turn around and gripe about changing demographics, and they can't put two and two together. Like, you can joke about the Ganges River being polluted or people defecating outside, but you stop and consider maybe that's because there are too many folks. It could be cultural, but it's also going to be a huge population that a river, which usually just is able to clean itself due to the flow, can't do so because there's so many people, and this has some religious importance. But even in the West, we have folks that in these cities overcrowding, crapping on the streets, and no one wants to face the more difficult question. So they'll say stuff like, oh, we can just fit everyone in Texas, brah. Problem solved. Yeah, until you have too much pollution, which is killing people, overcrowding, overstressing of the utility system. So folks are, in fact, defecating outside. Let's forget about all that. It doesn't really matter because it doesn't fit this agenda of everyone needs to reproduce because why exactly? Well, we can start taking a look in the next section. The young Hegelians believed that the origins of religion were the fact that man felt as a self conscious being alienated from the rest of creation, from other mammals. Human beings obviously are capable of things which most animals will never stop and even consider. But at the same time, they had to feel almost special. So the concept of the soul, being children of God, being created, not simply coming into existence. And this feeds in large part into the reflexive pronatalism argument. I know it's also prime directive, so there's an element of nature involved, but we can't afford to ignore that. And religions thrive by appealing to the greatest number. If you say, "Oh, you're all welcome, you're wonderful children of God," but then you stop and go, "Sorry, dude, you're 5'2" with a recessed chin, you probably shouldn't reproduce," that undermines your whole argument that God loves this person and created them for a purpose. So you can't afford to truly strive for genetic quality as a rule if at the same time you're telling everyone that God loves them and created them and they're special compared to any animal out there. So this is where it gets a bit complicated, unfortunately. It also seems to result in a situation where people have outsized egos and a sense of self-importance, which generally leads them in the path of saying, well, absolutely, I need to reproduce regardless of much consideration. So one of the arguments that we come across quite frequently is, dude, I need a legacy, man. Where's my legacy, brah? And this, the more you think about it, just comes off as a little bit ridiculous. Obviously, Napoleon had a legacy. He was a great, conqueror. He was an emperor. Then obviously he lost his kingdom, but people still remember Napoleon for his feats. People remember Charles Dickens for the stuff he published, and they still read. Even Churchill and Mustache Man, in the latter case, no official kids, they are admired or reviled to this day for various reasons, more so than, let's say, some guy in Serbia who from 1910 to 1925, he had a trad wife and 8 kids. Are his descendants still alive? Does anyone know his name? So absolutely raising a child is going to be rewarding, seeing them grow up. But your legacy, that seems to me a bit of a ego projection. You might be very active in your child's life, possibly grandchild. Most of you will not see grandkids because of, simple facts of, you don't have much control over that anyway because it depends on your kids and then their kids having kids at a certain time. And because humans tend to be somewhat egocentric, you're unlikely to be this major fixture in the life of your grandkids because you'll pass on earlier than they will in most cases, unless you were the one who raised them, which then that calls into question the legacy of your own kids and how did that turn out. It just seems to be a bit of that, person wanting to feel they're more relevant than they actually happen to be. And of course the response, oh, that's black pill. No, it's reality. Why does everything have to be black pilled if you just tell someone and you deflate their little myth about life? Nothing wrong with having kids, but stop thinking that you are this really important person who needs a legacy. That's just a bunch of projection. You're more likely to be remembered for great feats or things you've created than the fact that you had some kids. Your offspring is unlikely to truly remember you much beyond, like I said, the grandkid stage. And even there, it's up for debate. What happens, of course, with folks that take this religious view, which they feel that they are driven by God, they have to reproduce, be fruitful, multiply. Obviously, someone's going to tell me, yeah, but the early Christians would just join monasteries. And then you wouldn't have a global Christian religion if people weren't joining it and then raising their kids in it and their kids doing the same thing. You need to appeal to the largest number, as I said earlier. You cannot have some elitist structure because that's going to turn off a lot of folks. So what's been happening in that vein is that many of these trad bros, trad caths, Trump supporters, passport bros are trying to cheat the system, as in the very rough dating market of the West. Oh, we'll go to Southeast Asia and get a trad wife. Perfectly fine. I get it, okay? We have to play the cards we're dealt. I wouldn't go that route myself, but I understand. I'm not going to judge people. With that being said, I'm just going to put a little bit of advice out there. Unless you find some cream of the crop, Filipino or Vietnamese, upper class, 5'9", intelligent, attractive, decently high IQ, and you have to settle for some 5-foot village woman, please, for the love of God, do not have any sons. You'll be doing a great service to humanity because your daughters, even if they're not super pretty, someone will try to pump and dump them, someone will try to marry them. They have intrinsic value being a woman. But a kid who there's a decent chance will be 5'3", possibly ambiguous looking, maybe autistic. He's not going to have the advantage of, oh, I can be a passport bro, because he probably won't have an American passport. He is not going to have those benefits of being the exotic foreigner. And so more than likely his life will suck. Don't tell me stuff like, oh, my son's going to be Keanu Reeves, my son's going to be Tyson Beckford. You believe that. You want to believe it at least. And it's unlikely to occur. So just have daughters so they're not going to suffer because of being short or just not having much going for them. And he goes, oh, I need an heir, brah. Dude, you probably are a remote IT worker, or you teach ESL, or you unclog toilets or weld for a living. You do not need an heir. You're not Charlemagne. Stop with all this nonsense of I'm a king. Guys need to get that out of their head. You're a normal person. There's nothing wrong with you. But stop with this notion that you have to have this outsized sense of importance about your life. In fact, when religious people do this, it strikes me as they're missing the point of their religion, which is to say that why are you so arrogant and prideful about your own happening, as it were? I thought you were storing up treasures in heaven, but it seems like you have to do all this stuff in life to feel better about yourself. I find that very suspect from people who are kind of wear it on their sleeve. But yeah, just have daughters. Don't bring a son into the world who's going to suffer. It's already hard enough being male out there, and it's not going to be much enhanced if they have those set of traits. This brings me to the next section of the video. Before I talk about these folks in the picture, back when I worked retail, there was this couple that would come in from time to time. They were both in the 3 range, had 2 kids. The oldest had some kind of autism. He would make those screeching noises, and he was a bit disruptive, but compared to the younger one, more functional. The little kid was still in diapers, and I think at least once crapped on the floor of the store. This one was Down syndrome. Would go out screaming, taking DVD cases, sucking on them, throwing them on the floor. And the parents, you could just see on their faces, so resigned and defeated. They didn't even have the energy to police their own children. Now, you can imagine at some point a person was going, oh, it's so great, you guys are getting together. It's ordained by God, yada, yada. And then they have these children, which are a burden in some respect. And people go, well, it's a test of faith. You got to take that test of faith. Why is it that people who have already had the rough hand in life get the tests of faith? I've seen that so many times. It's really sad. So you have to struggle and suffer even more because your life isn't difficult enough. That seems like a very cruel, sadistic type of torture code, but what do I know? At any rate, going to the people in question here, this woman got a lot of attention some years back when there was a microcephaly scare in Brazil. For those of you who don't know, microcephaly is a condition where the brain never fully develops. And this woman, her oldest son was healthy. The next daughter had microcephaly, and inexplicably she chose to have a 3rd kid, which also had microcephaly. Now, some of you will say, well, she's a wonderful human being. She's doing this because she's such a strong Christian. And it makes sense. If you believe that God creates all human beings, God can't make a mistake. So if God creates a girl with microcephaly, you better keep it because it's a treasure and a blessing from God. I just don't know, because these girls will be vegetables their entire life. I think they both passed away. They don't live long. They're not even like a Down syndrome that maybe one day can kind of take care of themselves. And so you ask, is she truly compassionate? Or would it be better off if she had stopped at the first, or just not necessarily brought that one into the world? I struggle with this question myself, because I sometimes think all the care you have to apply to the daughters probably detracts from your son and attention that he's going to get. You also could be using that time and resources to foster a kid or adopt one, and there's nothing wrong with that. Like I said, the previous couple, maybe they would be better off. Maybe if you don't have great genetics, maybe you'd be better off being an adoptive parent. There's nothing wrong with that. These red pillars would say that's a cuck move. Do you know how many non-cucks are out there in the third world who have kids, and because of poverty, the kids don't get an education. They have to join the parents on like some fruit plantation to make quota, or some of them get forced into child prostitution, and that's considered red pill and based because it's traditional. Not everyone gets the nice suburban lifestyle where you go to PTA meetings and the soccer games. Some kids are generally suffering. They come from, oh yeah, non-cucked biological parents. So I do think people who maybe they have a genetic condition, or maybe they just, they just don't have the best genetics, they could be wonderful parents. It's not saying that they have no purpose or they're horrible human beings or anything like that, but they might be better off taking care of, the kids that do in fact need parents, instead of, oh yeah, let's replicate and potentially create something that's not really ideal. So let me know what your thoughts are on that. Do you think it's great when these parents of severely disabled kids keep them, or do you think it's kind of a waste of resources and time? I'm open to opinions and ideas and suggestions. Now, in terms of Goldberg's view on natalism, by no means am I opposed to it, but I take a slightly nuanced perspective. I love this meme because you've got Jesus, evolutionary success, and Darwin on the one side. But of course, their example of evolutionary success is the blonde Aryan queen, not the masses of short, dysgenic people who seem to populate the planet. I guess those are on the side of Satan. Ooh. Regardless, I believe in thoughtful natalism, and this entails looking at yourself, being honest. Okay, what are your pluses? And how will you, with a potential mate, what are you going to give your children? One of the worst things you can do is set your kids, especially your son, up to have a worse life than you based upon your choice of a partner. I mean, I could take a plane down to Mexico City and have a kid on the way within a week with some 5-foot mestiza. That doesn't mean it's a good idea. Myself being over 6 feet, ideally I want a woman who's at least 5'5" or above, because I don't want to enhance the probability of having some short son who's going to have to cope by watching Yogi Zero apps his whole life. And even daughters, you don't want your daughter to be labeled as fun-sized or feisty. Shorter people tend to have shorter tempers because they don't get respected. Just not a good thing in general. So shoot for a decent height, very much. And then a woman who preferably has more of a bubbly, extroverted personality, because a lot of personality traits are heritable. Some are just going to be environmental and experience. Myself, I'm fairly outgoing, but not super extroverted. And that's something where if your kids happen to take in those traits, life is much easier. Make friends easier, romantic connections, especially for boys, that is a tremendous advantage. Also, finding someone who's pretty close to you as far as ethnic background, that eliminates your kids having to deal with the split identity thing. I'm not going to say it's always an issue, but once more, the world is tough to live in, especially for a guy, and if you can avoid them having to deal with another problem, that's probably the right path to take. Finally, I could probably get with some -6 diopter prescription librarian chick more easily because she's into books, I read books. But I don't want to sentence all my kids to needing corrective lenses. Not only is it an aesthetic disadvantage, but there are lucrative careers where the doors will be closed if you don't have just naturally good vision. So a woman who does come out of the box 20/20, that would be a preference. You can look at other things like, does she have mental illness? Does she have, problems as far as genetics in her family? But those are good starting points. That's what I call thoughtful natalism. By the way, I'm not suggesting everyone's going to do this. Most will not. Most are still going to run back and cope with, oh, religion, trad values, true love. You do what you want. I'm just saying most folks are doing exactly that, and we see the results. We see a lot of dysgenic types walking around, and the parents will usually justify their decision with exactly those arguments. So, just my opinion. And I really harp on that. When you are going to have kids, think of the woman you're with and think of how that might affect your son. Because if you make the wrong choices, he's going to have a very rough life. I mean, unless he becomes a gay cell. I guess that could be the legacy for these trad guys or passport bros. A gay cell son. I'm just saying. So give me your thoughts on natalism. Are you 100% on board? Are you skeptical? Are you, if I meet someone who's right, or are you very much opposed?